She carried food trays for 31 days, smiled when they spilled soup on her uniform, said nothing when they called her slow, kept her head down when they laughed. They thought she was invisible. They were wrong, because while they were busy mocking the quiet woman in the kitchen, she was watching every single one of them, memorizing their patterns, their lies, their secrets. And the night one of them reached for a detonator that would have killed 300 soldiers, she was already 400 meters away, waiting, one breath, one shot, one chance. They never saw her coming. They never even knew her name. If this story hits different, follow the channel, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The mess hall at Bravo Kestrel Forward Operating Base smelled like burnt coffee, diesel exhaust, and the particular kind of institutional misery that came from feeding 400 soldiers 3 times a day on a rotating menu that hadn't changed in 6 months. Maya Reed had memorized every smell. She'd also memorized the coffee preferences of 32 personnel, the shift rotations of the overnight security team, the blind spots in the exterior camera coverage along the northeastern fence line, and the fact that the base's second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Graves, always took his morning briefing 5 minutes late on Tuesdays because he stopped to smoke behind the motor pool. Nobody noticed any of that, because nobody noticed Maya. That was the point. She arrived at 04:30 every morning, the same as the other kitchen staff, 2 local contractors, and a retired Army cook named Delbert, who talked too much about his knee surgery and too little about anything useful. Maya wore the same gray uniform they all wore, the same non-slip shoes, the same hair pulled back under a cloth cap. She moved through the kitchen at a pace that communicated competence without drawing attention, which was harder to calibrate than most people understood. Move too slow, you looked confused. Move too fast, you drew eyes. The sweet spot was a rhythm that made you look like furniture. She'd been here 31 days. The mission brief had estimated 3 to 4 weeks. She was right on schedule, which was the only thing going according to plan. "Reed," Delbert pointed at a full hotel pan of scrambled eggs sitting on the counter. "Those are getting cold. Chow line opens in 8. "I see them, Delbert." "Then move them." She moved them. The dining facility opened at 0500 for early shift personnel, and the first wave was always the same. Maintenance crews, communications techs, a few night duty security officers still in their kit from the overnight watch. They were tired and quiet, and they wanted food, not conversation. Maya had no problem with that. It was the later wave she watched carefully. The 0630 rush brought the operators. At Bravo Kestrel, the Special Operations Element was a 12-man SEAL detachment rotated in from a parent command that Maya's briefing files described simply as Naval Special Warfare, Detachment Kestrel 7. Their specific mission parameters were above her official read-in, but the files she'd been given were thorough enough. Names, backgrounds, service records, known associates, behavioral notes. She'd read those files until she could have recited them from memory, because that was what the job required. The lead figure was a man named Garrett Holt, 34 years old, 8 years in the teams. 2 combat deployments to confirmed hot zones and at least 1 that didn't appear in official records. His service jacket was clean, commendations, qualifications, a Navy Achievement Medal from an operation that was still classified. On paper, Garrett Holt was exactly what a SEAL was supposed to be. But paper lied. That was the first thing Maya had learned in her career, and it was the lesson she returned to most often. Paper lied because people constructed paper to say what they wanted it to say. The truth lived somewhere beneath the surface, in how a person moved, who they avoided, when their eyes went somewhere they shouldn't. She'd been watching Holt for 3 weeks. This morning, like every morning, he came through the chow line with 2 of his teammates, Braddock, a big-shouldered man from Louisiana who laughed too easily, and Finch, quieter, watchful, the kind of soldier who scanned a room when he entered it and only stopped scanning when he was confident he'd cataloged everything. Maya noted which ones were like Finch. Those were the ones who might eventually notice her noticing. She kept her attention on the steam table. "Eggs look garbage again," Braddock said, not to anyone in particular. "They're always garbage," Finch said. I'm just saying, there's powdered eggs and then there's actively bad powdered eggs. These are actively bad. Holt didn't say anything. He took a scoop of eggs, a piece of toast, a cup of black coffee. He moved to a table near the eastern wall, same seat he always took, which gave him a sightline to both entrance points and the window that faced the operations compound. Maya had noted that on day 2. She refilled the egg pan. The dining facility filled around her, noise rising in layers, scraping chairs, clinking utensils, a dozen overlapping conversations about equipment maintenance and weekend liberty and whether the resupply bird was going to be late again. Maya existed at the edge of all of it, carrying things, wiping things, staying invisible. Then Corporal Durso walked in. Durso was not part of the SEAL detachment. He was a signals intelligence specialist attached to the base communications section, 26 years old, from somewhere in central Ohio, and he had a nervous habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was thinking too hard about something he didn't want to show. Maya had noticed that in week 1. What she'd noticed in week 2 was that Durso and Garrett Holt didn't interact in the dining facility. They didn't sit near each other, didn't acknowledge each other, didn't make eye contact. Which was strange, because on the 3rd night of her deployment, Maya had watched through a gap in the motor pool fencing as the two of them stood together in the darkness near the Eastern Supply Depot and talked in low voices for 11 minutes. People who met in secret didn't acknowledge each other in public. That was operational security. Basic tradecraft. The kind of thing a person learned when they were trying to hide a relationship. Maya filed it away and kept moving. The incident happened on a Thursday. She'd been waiting for something like it. Not that specific thing. She couldn't have predicted the particular shape of it, but she'd known something was coming because that was the pattern. Men who felt comfortable in a space eventually tested the edges of what they could do in it. Men who had decided a person was beneath them eventually demonstrated that decision in front of witnesses. It was the lunch rush. The facility was packed. Close to 200 personnel cycling through in overlapping shifts, noise level high, the kitchen team running at full speed to keep pace. Maya was moving between the serving line and the back kitchen, carrying a full hotel pan of roasted vegetables, when Braddock stepped out from between 2 tables directly into her path. She stopped. He didn't move. "Watch where you're going." He said it flat, no particular heat in it, like she'd inconvenienced him by existing in the same space. "Excuse me," Maya said. She moved a step around him. The pan was heavy, close to 30 pounds with the full load, and she'd been on her feet for 7 hours. She kept her grip steady and her expression neutral. Braddock moved with her. She stopped again. Around them, the noise of the dining facility continued, but a few nearby tables had gone quieter. People noticed. Not all of them, but enough. "I heard you dropped a whole tray last week," Braddock said. His voice had changed slightly, louder, playing to the space. "That true?" "I don't think so." "No?" He looked around at the nearest tables. Finch was there. 2 other operators she'd tagged as Riggs and Carver. "Delbert said you dropped a full tray of dishes. Made a hell of a mess." Delbert had said no such thing. "I need to get this to the line," Maya said. "Sure," Braddock smiled. "Right after you tell me how a woman who can't hold on to a tray got a job working in a military facility." The nearby tables had gone quiet enough that she could hear it. Maya felt the weight of the pan in her hands, the burn starting in her forearms, and she looked at Braddock with an expression she'd practiced until it was automatic. Calm, slightly tired, completely unreadable. "I hold on to things fine," she said. "Doesn't look like it from here." "Then don't look." Braddock's smile didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. What? A flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed. He wasn't used to being answered. Maya filed that away. She moved around him and reached the serving line and set the pan down without spilling a single piece of vegetable. And she kept her back to the room while she did it so no one could read her face in that moment, because there was something that lived behind her control that she kept in a very small box, and this was the kind of situation that rattled the lid. She heard him say something to the table. Laughter followed. Maya went back to the kitchen and started on the next task. She had a system. Every morning she committed what she called a situation summary. Not written down, never written down. cataloging the previous 24 hours in terms of what had changed, what hadn't, what needed attention. It was a habit built over 12 years of work that required her to carry entire operational pictures in her head without the comfort of notes. Current situation. Garrett Holt, senior enlisted, SEAL detachment. Behavioral anomalies. Guarded communication patterns. Consistent monitoring of the operations compound scheduling board. 11-minute clandestine meeting with base signal specialist Corporal Durso on day 3, 2 additional suspected contacts that Maya had not yet been able to observe directly. Durso. Elevated anxiety markers across 4 weeks of observation. Increased caffeine consumption. Disrupted sleep patterns visible in appearance. 3 separate instances of accessing communication terminals during off hours, which was logged but apparently not flagged by base security. Connecting element. Unknown. That was the gap in her picture. She knew the relationship existed. She didn't yet know what they were trading or why or what it was building toward. The files she'd been given before insertion described the leak in operational terms. Classified movement schedules and unit positioning data from Bravo Kestrel had appeared in intelligence summaries recovered from a compromised regional network. The damage was assessed as significant. The source was assessed as internal, with access to both SIGINT terminals and operational planning materials. That description fit exactly 2 people on base. The investigation had narrowed to those 2 people before Maya was ever deployed, but narrowing was not the same as proving, and proving was not the same as neutralizing. Her job was to get close enough to confirm, document, and, if necessary, act. The if necessary part was what she thought about most. In the quiet hours after the kitchen closed and she was back in the small room she'd been assigned in the civilian contractor quarters. She hoped it wouldn't come to that. She was starting to think it would. Friday morning, week 5. Maya was on dish rotation. The least desirable assignment in the kitchen, which was why she'd requested it. Dish rotation kept her stationary near the return window, which gave her a continuous view of the entire dining facility for 3-hour blocks without requiring her to move through it. She could watch the room while appearing to watch nothing. Garrett Holt came through at 0641. His behavior was different. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that would register as nothing to most observers. He sat in his usual seat, same as always, took the same food, drank his coffee, talked briefly with Riggs about something Maya couldn't hear at this distance. Nothing outwardly unusual, but his right hand was resting on the table rather than in his lap. He did that when he was waiting for something. She'd noticed it at the clandestine meeting near the motor pool, the way he'd kept his hand visible on his knee the entire time he was talking to Durso. Not a dominant posture, a ready posture, like he was expecting to need to move. Maya tracked the room. Durso entered at 0649, later than usual. He went through the line without taking much food, coffee, and a single piece of toast, and sat at the far end of the room, well away from Holt, as always. But before he sat down, he passed the table where Riggs and Carver were eating, and for a moment, less than a second, he set his tray down with his left hand while his right hand dropped briefly below table level. He didn't stop moving. He was at his own table 30 seconds later, eating his toast, reading something on his phone. Maya kept washing dishes. She ran it back in her head 4 times, working the geometry of it, the angle of approach, the brief hand position, the movement that looked casual but wasn't. Durso had passed something, or taken something. The exchange had been under 3 seconds from start to finish, and both men had continued moving without any visible disruption to their behavior. That was practiced. That was not the first time they'd done that. She kept her face neutral and her hands in the water and her breathing even, and she thought about what she'd just seen and what it meant and what she needed to do next, and the thing in the small box rattled its lid again. Braddock found her in the hallway between the kitchen and the storage room that afternoon. He wasn't alone. Riggs was with him, and a third man she'd cataloged but didn't have a confirmed name for. Mid-20s, thick neck, the particular kind of easy aggression that came from never having had it seriously tested. "Kitchen girl," Braddock said. Maya was carrying a case of canned goods, 24 pounds. She stopped and looked at him. "Braddock," she said. He looked at the case. "You look like you're struggling." "I'm not." "Here." He stepped forward and took the case out of her arms. Not asking, just taking. She let him because the alternative involved a decision tree that ended in places she didn't need to go right now. He set the case down on the floor. Then he looked at her with that same flat smile. "My guys think you're funny," he said. "The quiet act. The whole," he gestured vaguely at her, "thing you do. Very serious. Very mysterious." "I'm just working." "Sure." He crossed his arms. "Where'd you work before this?" "Food service." "Where?" "Various places." "Various places," he repeated. He looked back at Riggs, who said nothing. "You ex-military?" The question landed differently than the others. Maya met his eyes. "Why would you think that?" "The way you walk," he said. "The way you—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "The way you're standing right now. Most civilians, they'd be nervous. You're not nervous." "Should I be?" A beat of silence. "No," Braddock said finally. "Just an observation." He stepped back and let her pick up the case. She carried it to the storage room and set it on the shelf and stood in the dark for 10 seconds with her hand pressed flat against the metal shelving and let herself be completely still, because Braddock had just noticed something real, and that meant her cover had developed a crack she hadn't seen coming. That was a problem, but not the largest problem, because that evening, when she ran her situation summary, she added a new entry, a detail she'd noticed while Braddock was standing in front of her, close enough that she could see the inside of his wrist where his sleeve had ridden up. A tattoo. She'd seen a lot of tattoos on a lot of soldiers, that was expected, but this one was different. It wasn't the tattoo itself that registered. It was the specific design, which she recognized because she'd spent 2 hours the night before her insertion memorizing a document titled Suspected Affiliated Symbology, Regional Threat Networks, Current Assessment Period. The design on Braddock's wrist was a variation of a geometric pattern associated with a specific network, a network that the same document described as currently running active interference operations against U.S. forward elements in this theater. She stood in the dark storage room and processed that for 10 full seconds. Then she updated her situation summary. The picture had just gotten significantly larger and significantly worse. She had originally been looking for a leak. What she was starting to find looked less like a leak and more like a penetration. 3 people, not 2. At minimum, she needed more time, she needed confirmation. And she needed to move very carefully, because if Braddock had noticed something real in the way she stood, then she was already closer to the edge than she'd calculated. She picked up the empty cardboard case and walked back toward the kitchen and made sure her footsteps were soft, and her expression was empty, and her breathing was the same measured pace it always was. Because the moment the mask slipped was the moment everything unraveled, and there were still people depending on her to hold it together. She just didn't know yet that she had less time than she thought. The call came through the base communications net at 22:47 that night. Maya was in her room running her evening protocol, notes committed to memory, gear check, 3-hour sleep cycle before the 0200 perimeter walk she'd been taking since week 2 under the cover of insomnia. She'd told Delbert about the insomnia early in her deployment, casually, over coffee, so it would be a known fact if anyone ever checked her movement logs. The call was base-wide. Mandatory recall for all personnel with access to the operational planning section. She listened through the thin wall of her quarters as footsteps moved through the contractor housing block. Voices, quick and quiet. The sound of doors. Something had happened. She stayed in her room and waited, because her cover identity didn't have planning section access, and showing up where she wasn't supposed to be was the kind of mistake that ended missions in the worst possible ways. 20 minutes later, she heard Delbert's voice in the corridor. "What's going on?" She opened her door. He was standing in the hallway in civilian clothes, looking somewhere between alarmed and annoyed, which was his default state when plans changed without warning. "Don't know." He shook his head. "Comms section found something. That's all I heard." "Found what?" "I just said I don't know, Reed." He went back to his room. Maya stood in her doorway for a moment. The hallway was quiet. Outside, she could hear vehicles moving. The particular sound of the light tactical trucks used by the Quick Reaction Force when they were spinning up. Comms section found something. She thought about Durso. She thought about the exchange she'd watched that morning, the tray, the brief movement, under 3 seconds. She thought about what Durso's access level would have given someone like Garrett Holt, and she thought about the fact that the QRF was moving at 2,300 on a Friday night, when the base commander was off compound at a coordination meeting that had been on the published schedule for 2 weeks. The timing wasn't coincidental. Nothing ever was. She closed her door and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and opened the hidden panel beneath the bed frame, the one she'd installed in the first 72 hours, behind a section of prefabricated wall that nobody checked because nobody thought anything worth checking was back there. And she looked at what was inside. She didn't touch anything yet, but she looked, and she thought, I need 24 more hours. The problem was that 24 hours might be exactly what they didn't have. The vehicles outside didn't stop moving. Maya sat on the edge of her bed and listened to them, the particular grind of the light tacticals shifting through the gate, the distant shout of someone calling a name she couldn't make out, the base settling into the elevated alert version of itself that felt different from normal night operations in a way that was difficult to describe, but impossible to miss once you'd felt it enough times. The air changed. Everything got slightly faster without appearing to. She'd felt that specific atmosphere on 4 continents. It never meant anything good. She closed the panel beneath the bed frame and lay back on the mattress, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, and ran the geometry of the situation for the 3rd time. The mandatory recall to the planning section. The QRF spinning up. Durso's morning exchange under 3 seconds, practiced and clean. Holt's hand resting on the table. Braddock's tattoo on the inside of his wrist. The variant geometric, the one from the symbology document she'd committed to memory the night before insertion. The base commander off compound. The timing wasn't coincidental. She kept coming back to that. In her experience, timing was the one thing people couldn't fully control. They could control behavior, language, associations. But timing left marks. Timing was the thing that, when you pulled the thread on it, everything else unraveled behind it. At 2318, her room phone rang. It was the internal baseline, the kind of landline that existed solely because command elements didn't trust digital comms to be the only communications infrastructure during elevated security periods. It rang twice before she answered it. "Reed," she said, "this is Sergeant Villanueva from the Dining Facility Coordination Office." A woman's voice, professional, slightly tired. "We're putting all non-essential civilian contractor staff on restricted movement until further notice. That means you stay in your quarters or designated rest areas. Don't go to the facility until you hear from us." "Understood," Maya said. "Can you tell me what's happening?" A pause. "It's an administrative matter. Stay in quarters." The line went dead. Maya set the handset down and looked at the ceiling again. Administrative matter. The QRF was not an administrative response. She slept in 90-minute blocks, the way she'd trained herself to years ago when sleep was a resource to be managed rather than something that just happened. First block from 2330 to 0100. Second from 0115 to 0245. By 0300, she was awake and functional, which was what she needed to be. The base had quieted, but not all the way. She could still hear foot traffic outside, more than normal for 0300, moving in a pattern that suggested a perimeter check rather than random movement. They'd increased the exterior patrols sometime in the night. She ran through her options. The restricted movement order technically confined her to quarters and the designated break areas, which included the small day room 3 doors down that had a coffee machine and a window facing the motor pool. The window wasn't useful for observation. The angle was wrong. But the day room itself gave her a reason to be outside her room if anyone checked, and the corridor to it ran past a junction that had sight lines to both the communications building and the eastern side of the operations compound. She put on her shoes and went to get coffee. The corridor was empty. The day room was empty. She filled a paper cup from the machine. The coffee was terrible, same as always, slightly scorched with an aftertaste like hot water had been run through it too many times, and stood near the window without standing directly in front of it, because standing directly in front of a window at 0300 when there were elevated patrols outside was the kind of thing that drew attention. The motor pool was quiet. 2 vehicles in the near lot, neither of them with lights. Through the gap between buildings, she could see the edge of the communications building, lit from inside, which was not standard for 0300. The building should have been skeleton crude. The number of lit windows said otherwise. So, something significant had been found or was being processed, and it was coming through communications channels, and somebody had decided to pull in all the comms resources to handle it. That tracked with the Durso angle. If Durso had moved something through the SIGINT terminals, a subsequent audit would come back to that building, those terminals, those access logs, which meant Durso knew something had been found, which meant Holt knew, which possibly meant the timeline on whatever they were building toward had just accelerated. Maya drank her terrible coffee and thought about the gap in her picture. She still didn't have the what. She had the who. 3 people, minimum. And she had the confirmed relationship between Holt and Durso, and she had the symbology that connected Braddock to the regional network. What she didn't have was the specific operational objective. What were they moving toward? What was the information being used for? The planning section recall. She kept coming back to that. Mandatory recall for all personnel with access to operational planning. That was a very specific subset of the base population. Senior NCOs, commissioned officers, the detachment leadership. The SEAL Element's senior members would have been included in that, which meant Holt had been in that room tonight with whatever information had triggered the recall. That was either a problem or an opportunity. She wasn't sure which yet. She finished the coffee and went back to her room and lay down for the 3rd block. The morning started wrong. She arrived at the dining facility at 0430, as always, and Delbert was already there, which was normal. But Delbert was standing near the back entrance instead of inside it, talking to a man in uniform that Maya didn't immediately recognize. Early 40s, a command sergeant major's rank on his collar, the particular posture of someone who gave orders in environments where orders were the entire structure of reality. She noted him and kept walking toward the entrance. "Reed," Delbert called her over. She went. The sergeant major looked at her with the specific economy of a person who assessed people very quickly and considered it a waste of time to pretend otherwise. He had a clipboard. "Maya Reed, civilian contractor, food services?" "Yes, Sergeant Major." "You were notified of the restricted movement order last night." "I was." "Were you in your quarters during the restriction period?" "I went to the day room for coffee around 0300. Couldn't sleep. I mentioned the insomnia to Delbert told me. He also said you've been reliable and unproblematic for the duration of your assignment." He looked at his clipboard. "Your background check is clean. No flags." "Is there a problem?" "We're doing verification checks on all contractor personnel this morning. Standard procedure following a security event." He looked up from the clipboard. "You'll be cleared to work in approximately 2 hours. Until then, wait in the day room." "Can I ask what kind of security event?" The sergeant major's expression didn't change, but something in it communicated very clearly that the answer to that question was no. 2 hours, he said. "Day room." She went to the day room. The verification process took closer to 3 hours than 2. She was interviewed by a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as from the Installation Security Office and asked a set of questions that started with the standard background verification items and gradually became more specific. Had Maya witnessed any unusual behavior among base personnel? Had anyone approached her with requests outside her normal duties? Had she observed any meetings between personnel that seemed unusual? Maya answered all of it truthfully, except the parts that would have ended her cover and blown the investigation, which was most of it. "I'm a kitchen contractor," she said, when the security officer's questions started angling toward observations about specific personnel. "I carry food and wash dishes. People don't really talk to me. You've been here over a month. You see things. I see people eating. I see tired soldiers who want coffee. I see—" She paused, letting something real cross her face, because sometimes the most convincing thing was a controlled version of the truth. "I see a lot of people who don't notice kitchen staff at all." The security officer looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something down and closed her folder. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Reed. You can return to work." Maya thanked her and left and went back to the kitchen, and the thing in the small box knocked around more than she was comfortable with, because 3 hours of verification interviews on contractor staff meant the security office had identified a significant breach and was building the case methodically. That was the right process. She knew that. But methodical took time, and time was the variable she was no longer confident about. The dining facility opened late, 08:15 instead of the usual 0500, and the atmosphere inside it was different from any morning Maya had experienced in 5 weeks. It wasn't loud. Even the soldiers who were normally highest volume, the maintenance crews, the younger enlisted men who ate fast and talked fast and treated the chow hall like a break in a machine rather than a meal, were quieter. The tables had the specific density of people who were aware that something had happened and were unsure what they were allowed to say about it. Holt came in at 08:30. She watched him from the serving line. He looked exactly the same as he always looked. The same unhurried approach to the food, the same table near the eastern wall, the same coffee. But his right hand was on the table from the moment he sat down, and at 08:42 he checked his watch twice within 4 minutes. Braddock came in at 08:51 and sat 2 tables away. Not his usual seat. He took a position that gave him a sight line to the main entrance and the internal corridor to the communications wing. Maya cataloged that without making it visible. Durso didn't come in at all. That was new. She refilled the egg pan. She moved trays. She went to the back kitchen for the next load of food and stood briefly in the noise of the exhaust fans and let herself run the update. Durso's absence could mean a lot of things. He could be in interviews. He could be sleeping off a night shift. He could be under some form of informal scrutiny that hadn't yet formalized. Or he could have been pulled in directly as a result of whatever the security office had found. She needed to know which. Whoa. Braddock found her at the dish return window at 09:20. He came alone this time, without Riggs or the thick-necked man from the hallway. He leaned against the counter on the customer side of the window in a way that blocked her view of the room and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Less flat than usual, more pointed. "Busy morning," he said. "It's always busy," she said. "I mean for the base, the whole security review situation." He watched her. "You get interviewed?" "Everyone got interviewed." "What did they ask you?" She looked up from the dish rack. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what did they ask you?" He said it the same way he said everything, level, unhurried, the tone of a man who expected to be answered. "The contractor verification interviews, what were the questions?" Maya set a cup on the drying rack. "Standard stuff, background verification, work history." "Nothing specific?" "Like what?" A pause. He was looking at her in a way she filed away carefully. Not the aggressive disinterest from before, not the flat social dominance from the hallway incident. This was something more focused, like he was looking for something specific and hadn't found it yet. "Nothing," he said, just making sure the process wasn't too disruptive for the support staff. "It was fine," Maya said. He pushed off from the counter and walked away. She kept washing dishes and didn't watch him go and waited until she heard his footsteps clear the doorway before she let herself exhale. That was not a casual check-in. That was intelligence collection. He was running a verification of his own, trying to establish what the security office had asked, how deep the inquiry was going, whether the contractor staff had been given any information that indicated where the investigation was focused. It was a standard counter-investigation move. The fact that he was doing it personally, without much cover for the approach, meant one of two things. Either he was confident enough in his own position that he didn't feel the need to be subtle, or he was under time pressure and subtlety had become a secondary concern. Neither option was comfortable. She went through the rest of the morning shift on autopilot, running the conversation back repeatedly, extracting what she could from the things he'd said and the things he hadn't, the way he'd positioned himself at the window, the timing of it. 20 minutes after he'd arrived in the dining facility, which meant he'd spent those 20 minutes deciding to approach her, or waiting until the room had emptied enough to give him a clean window. At 1100, during the mid-morning lull when the kitchen staff took a rotating break, she went outside to the small concrete area beside the exterior entrance where Delbert sometimes smoked, and she stood in the thin morning light and looked at the fence line in the distance and thought carefully about what she was going to do. Her mission parameters were clear: observe, confirm, document, report. She was not authorized to take direct action except in circumstances where immediate threat to life existed and no other option was available. Those parameters had been established by the same senior officer who had deployed her here for reasons that were operationally sound. Acting prematurely on incomplete intelligence was how investigations collapsed and subjects walked free. But the picture was shifting. Durso's absence, Braddock's intelligence collection, Holt's watch checking, the QRF movement the night before. Something was in motion. The question was whether it had already passed the threshold that her parameters were designed to protect against. She needed to make contact with her handler. The problem was that her designated contact protocol required a 24-hour notice window under normal circumstances, or a specific trigger event under emergency circumstances. The trigger event definition in her mission brief was unambiguous: confirmed an imminent threat to personnel or critical infrastructure. She had suspected threat. She had behavioral indicators. She did not yet have confirmation. She went back inside. The afternoon shift was lunch service, and the dining facility filled hard at 11:30. The midday rush was always the most compressed, 200 people cycling through in 90 minutes with a kitchen team running at capacity to keep pace. Maya was on the serving line, which she preferred to the back because it gave her the room. It was during this rush that she saw Durso. He came in at 11:47, looking like he hadn't slept. His face had the particular texture of someone who'd been awake for close to 24 hours. The gray pallor, the slightly unfocused quality of the eyes, the way he moved slightly too carefully, like his proprioception was off. He went through the line without looking at anything except the food in front of him. When he got to Maya's station, he held out his tray and she put a scoop of the roasted chicken on it. And in the half-second of proximity, the brief moment when he was close enough and the noise of the line was high enough to cover low speech, she heard him say something under his breath. She wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly. She kept her face neutral and moved to the next person's tray, and let the words sit in her head while her hands kept working. What she thought she'd heard was, "They know it's me." 3 words, barely audible. His eyes hadn't met hers. He'd said it looking at the food, like a man talking to himself or saying something out loud because the pressure of holding it inside had become too much. The kind of thing a person did when they were past a certain threshold of fear and the filter between thought and speech started to degrade. He moved down the line. Maya kept serving. Her hands were completely steady. Her chest was not. They know it's me. If that was what she'd heard, and she was putting it at 85% confidence, because the noise level was real, and she could have been wrong, then Durso was aware that the security investigation had identified him, which meant he was either about to run, about to be picked up, or about to do something to accelerate whatever the operation's end state was, because men who knew they were caught and who were embedded in something larger than themselves had very limited options, and most of them were bad. She needed to make contact tonight. She was done waiting for the 24-hour window. The afternoon passed in the particular grinding way that afternoons passed when you were managing high-level cognitive processing inside a job that required you to look like you were thinking about dishes. Maya moved through the closing service tasks, clearing the line, breaking down the steam table, running the first loads of dishes through the industrial washer, and kept her attention distributed between the work in front of her and the broader sensory environment of the base outside, which she could monitor in fragments through the exterior door, the narrow window above the dish sink, the sounds that filtered through the walls. At 1600, she heard the QRF trucks again. Not moving this time. Idling. The sound carried differently. They were staged, not in motion, which meant they were being held ready. Delbert came into the kitchen from the back door and stood for a moment with his hands on his hips, looking at nothing in particular. He had the expression of a man who was processing something that didn't add up. "Something's going on," he said. "What do you mean?" 2 of the permanent kitchen staff just got their access badges pulled. He looked at her. "Garrison. And Weiss. No explanation. They told them to wait in the security office." Garrison and Weiss were both local national contractors who had been here significantly longer than Maya. She knew their faces, their routines, the way they moved through the kitchen. She'd assessed them and set them aside in week 2. Why would they pull their badges? She said, keeping her voice at the right level. Mildly curious, slightly concerned. Hell if I know. Delbert shook his head. Garrison's been here 3 years. 3 years with no problems. And now... He made a gesture that communicated his frustration with institutional illogic. I'm just saying something's going on. Do you know what they found in the security thing last night? Delbert looked at her. For a moment she thought he was going to say something significant. He had the particular weight of a man holding information he wasn't supposed to share and was deciding whether to. I heard something, he said. I shouldn't repeat it. Delbert. I heard there was a package, he said, a physical package, found in the communications building, in Durso's workspace. She kept her face still. What kind of package? The kind that isn't supposed to be there. He picked up a dish towel and started drying something that was already dry. That's all I know. I shouldn't have said that much. Maya nodded and went back to the steam table. A physical package in Durso's workspace. That was either equipment, a device of some kind, or it was documentation. Either way, it confirmed what she'd been running. This wasn't a passive information leak. This was active preparation for something. And if the security office had found it, then Durso's timeline had collapsed. He was either in custody, about to be in custody, or he had been tipped that they'd found it and was now operating in the final phase of whatever this was. The QRF trucks were still idling. The thing in the box knocked loudly. At 17:30, an hour before the end of her shift, Holt walked into the kitchen. He'd never done that before. The kitchen was off limits to non-staff personnel. There were signs posted, and the institutional separation between the cooking area and the service area was one of those arbitrary territorial realities that people on bases observed without question, because there were 1,000 arbitrary territorial realities on a base, and most of them existed for reasons nobody remembered. Holt walked in like the signs weren't there. Delbert started to say something and then looked at Holt's rank and decided not to. Holt looked at Maya. Reed, right? Yes. Walk with me for a second. It wasn't a question. She set down what she was holding and followed him out the back door and into the service alley behind the kitchen block, a concrete channel between buildings that smelled like garbage containers and cleaning chemicals, partly shaded by an overhang that caught the late afternoon light. He stopped and turned to face her. She had done this enough times to know how to stand when a man was trying to size her up, weight balanced, nothing in her posture that communicated tension. She looked at him the same way she had looked at the security office interviewer that morning, open and slightly tired. How long have you been at this facility? He asked. 35 days? You get along with the other staff okay? Well enough. He studied her for a moment. He had a particular quality that she'd noticed in the first week, the ability to be still in a way that most people weren't. Not the stillness of discomfort or calculation, but the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to wait without broadcasting their waiting. She respected it as a skill. She didn't let that respect show. Braddock mentioned talking to you earlier, Holt said. He said you were helpful. I don't think I told him anything very interesting. He seemed to think you were. He paused. He has good instincts about people. That's a useful quality. It is. Another pause. The QRF trucks were still audible in the distance, a low rumble that framed the silence between them. You ever been in a base security situation before? The restricted movement, the interviews? No. It can be unsettling. I'm fine, she said. Good. He nodded, but he was still watching her in that way, and she became suddenly, precisely aware that this was not a casual check-in, just as Braddock's dish window conversation had not been a casual check-in. These were deliberate, coordinated. They were running a parallel assessment, trying to establish whether the contractor staff had been given any directional information that would indicate how close the investigation was to the people they were protecting. She was being vetted by the people she was investigating. I should get back, she said. Service prep. Sure. He stepped aside. Thanks for taking the time. She went back inside and picked up exactly what she'd been doing, and her hands were steady, and her breathing was even, and the only outward sign that anything had happened was that she didn't speak for the next 20 minutes, which Delbert apparently noticed because at 1800 he gave her a look and said, "You okay?" "Long day," she said. "Yeah." He dried another already dry dish. Long day for everyone. At 1900, the shift ended. Maya changed out of her kitchen uniform in the staff locker room and walked back toward the contractor housing block through the early evening, the sky going orange behind the western buildings, the base settling into the particular rhythm of early evening, the smell of the mess hall fading behind her, and the exhaust and dust smell of the operational area taking over. She was 50 meters from the housing block entrance when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She tracked the sound. One person, moderate pace, not trying to be quiet. Then a voice. "Reed." She turned. It was Finch. She'd categorized Finch early. The watchful one, the room scanner. He'd been peripheral to the interaction she'd had with Braddock and Holt, always nearby but never primary. He was looking at her now, with an expression that was harder to read than either of the others. "Sergeant Finch," she said. He stopped about 3 meters away. "I just wanted to say something." She waited. "Braddock's an ass," he said. "What happened in the dining facility the other day? The tray thing." He shook his head. "That was out of line." She looked at him. This was unexpected. Not unmanageable, but unexpected, which was the same thing in her line of work. "I appreciate that," she said. "I've been watching the civilian staff get jerked around all day over this security thing, and it's—" He paused, seeming to choose his next word. "It's not right. People doing their jobs getting caught up in something they didn't cause." "It's a difficult situation for everyone," she said carefully. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she filed away. Then he nodded once. "Yeah, well." He shifted his weight. "Watch yourself, okay?" She studied him. "Is there something specific I should watch for?" He held her gaze for a beat. "Just, the base is elevated right now. Things can go sideways fast in situations like this. Stick to your designated areas. Don't put yourself somewhere you're not supposed to be." He turned and walked away. Maya stood in the path and watched him go and turned the exchange over twice, 3 times, looking for the angle. Warning or threat? Genuine concern or a more sophisticated version of what Holt and Braddock had been doing? Or something else? A man who was genuinely not part of what she thought he might be part of, watching a situation deteriorate around him and doing the limited thing that his position allowed? She didn't have enough to know. She filed it as ambiguous and went to her room and locked the door and sat on the floor with her back against the bed frame and thought about Durso and the package in the communications building and Holt checking his watch and the QRF trucks that had been idling for 3 hours. The timeline was not hers anymore. She could feel it, the way a mission felt when the variables you'd been holding in suspension started to solidify, when the shape of the thing became visible and the shape was worse than you'd been allowing yourself to anticipate. She needed to get to her communications equipment, tonight. The floor was cold through her clothes, but she stayed there anyway, back against the bed frame, running the problem until it stopped being a problem. She could think her way around and became a problem she had to act on. The communications equipment was in the panel beneath the bed. She could reach it in 30 seconds. The protocol for emergency contact required a burst transmission on a frequency that her handler monitored during 2 windows, 2100 and 0200. She had 40 minutes until the first window. The question was whether using it would compromise her position. Burst transmissions were short, under 3 seconds of actual signal, heavily encrypted, designed to be indistinguishable from background noise to any listener without the specific decryption architecture. The risk of detection on her end was low, but low wasn't zero, and she was in a housing block with elevated patrol activity and at least one person, Holt, who had already demonstrated he was running parallel assessments of the contractor staff. She waited for 4 minutes. Then she pulled the panel open and got to work. The equipment was compact, the size of a paperback book, matte black casing, no markings. She'd checked it every 3rd day since insertion, which was the maintenance protocol. She checked it now. Battery at 73%, internal clock synchronized, transmission array intact. She composed the message in her head first. Brevity was the requirement, not just a preference. Her handler's standing instruction was that emergency burst transmissions should contain only what could not wait, in the fewest words that conveyed it accurately. What could not wait? 3 confirmed subjects, not 2. Physical package recovered from SIGINT terminal area. Base security elevated, subjects conducting counter-assessment of contractor staff. Subject Durso showing behavioral indicators consistent with timeline acceleration. QRF staged. Request authorization for active posture. She compressed it further. Then she sent it. The transmission took 2.4 seconds. She closed the equipment down, replaced it in the panel, and sat on the edge of the bed and waited. The handler's acknowledgement, if it came, would arrive in the 0200 window, which meant she had a 5-hour gap in which she knew she'd sent the message, but didn't know if it had been received, acted on, or if anyone outside this base was now moving in response to what she'd reported. 5 hours was a long time when a timeline was accelerating. She lay back on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and listened to the base. Hulk. She was awake at 0130 without needing the alarm she'd set. The base was quieter than it had been at 0300 the previous night. The elevated patrol pattern had settled into something more routine, which either meant the situation had de-escalated or the people running the perimeter had gotten tired, which was the more probable explanation. Security postures rarely sustained peak activity for more than 18 hours before human fatigue started smoothing out the sharp edges. At 0158, she opened the panel and powered the equipment. At 0201, the acknowledgement came through. She decrypted it in her head. 3 words and a number. Confirmed. Expand. 06000. She sat with that for a moment. Confirmed meant the handler had received and her intelligence was being acted on at command level. Expand meant her authorization had been upgraded. She was no longer observation only. And 0600 was the time of a command-level response, which meant someone above her handler's pay grade had made a decision about this base in the last several hours, and that decision was arriving at 6 in the morning. Whatever was coming in at 600 hours, she needed to be ready for it. And whatever the subjects were planning, it was running on a parallel clock. She closed the equipment down and looked at the inside of the panel for a moment before she replaced the cover. Then she reached further back, past the communications package, past the extra battery cells, and her hand found the shape she'd been avoiding for 5 weeks. The case was hard-sided polymer, standard issue for the platform it housed. She didn't open it. She just ran her fingers across the surface in the dark, the way a person might check something they already knew was there, just to confirm that the world was still the same shape it had been when they last looked. Then she replaced the panel. Then she waited for morning. Quartet. Breakfast service on base started at 0500, and Maya was in the kitchen at 0428, same as always. Delbert arrived at 0431 and looked at her like he'd expected her not to be there, which told her that whatever was circulating among the permanent base staff had grown overnight into something with visible edges. He didn't say anything. He started the coffee and pulled the first sheet pans out of the lowboy, and they worked in parallel without talking, which was fine. At 0520, the first wave of early shift personnel came through. They were quieter than normal. Not the alert quiet of people managing tension, but the flat quiet of people who had been informed of something and were processing it internally. Maya read the room in pieces. Posture, eye movement, the particular way certain clusters of people weren't talking to each other when they usually did. Something had been communicated through the command chain overnight. She didn't know what. At 0610, 10 minutes past the window that had been in her handler's message, nothing external had changed. At 0618, it changed. She heard the helicopters before she saw anything, 2 of them, the heavy thudding of rotor wash coming in low and fast from the west. Not the standard resupply pattern, but an approach vector that came directly over the base rather than around it. The sound hit the walls of the dining facility and rattled the near window slightly. Several soldiers at the tables looked up. Maya kept her eyes on the serving line. She heard the helicopters touch down in what she calculated was the primary landing zone near the command complex, which was approximately 200 meters from the dining facility. The rotor cycled down over the next 4 minutes. Then there were voices outside, command-level voices, carrying across the compound in the way that voices did when the people they came from were used to being heard. At 0631, Sergeant Major Villanueva, the man with the clipboard from the contractor verification process, came into the dining facility and spoke briefly with the staff sergeant managing the morning duty section. The staff sergeant's expression changed. He started moving toward the entrance with a radio in his hand. Things were moving. The question was which timeline was winning. Holt came in at 0640, and the moment he crossed the threshold, she knew something was different. It was the hand. His right hand was not on the table when he sat down. He sat with both hands in his lap, which he had not observed once in 5 weeks. And he didn't take his usual seat. He sat at a table near the center of the room, worse sight lines closer to the main foot traffic pattern, a position that didn't make sense for a man who had consistently chosen the wall seat with dual entrance coverage. He was distracted. She watched him in the peripheral way she'd practiced, not looking at him directly, reading him in the gaps between other actions, the way you read the edges of something that you couldn't look at straight. He checked his watch at 0642, then again at 0649. Then he pushed his food around without eating it and stood up and left at 0651, which was the shortest he'd ever stayed in the dining facility. At 07:03, Braddock came in. He went through the line and got to Maya's station and held out his tray, and in the 3 seconds that he was standing in front of her, she looked at his face and understood something she hadn't had confirmation of before. The flat social aggression was gone. What was underneath it was neither better nor worse. It was just different, focused in a specific direction. He was running out of casual time. "Eggs," he said. She put eggs on his tray. He moved down the line. The incident happened at 7:31. Maya was in the back kitchen loading the second wave of breakfast trays onto the service cart when she heard the sound from the dining facility. Not a crash, not a shout, but the sudden collapse of ambient noise that happened when something in a room stopped and people started paying attention to the same thing. She came to the kitchen threshold and looked through. Durso was standing near the service entrance, and he did not look like a man who had come for breakfast. He was in his working uniform, but it was wrong. Untucked at the back, collar open, a smear of something on the left sleeve that he hadn't noticed or didn't care about. His face was the gray of 30-plus sleepless hours, and his eyes were moving too fast, scanning the room in a way that wasn't operational awareness. It was panic looking for an exit. He was holding a phone, not a military-issue device, a personal cell, which should have been in the contraband locker with everyone else's at the start of the deployment, which meant he'd either kept it hidden or had access to one that wasn't logged. Nobody was speaking to him. The nearest tables had a gap around him that people had created without appearing to create it, the unconscious distancing from someone who was clearly in a bad state. Then Holt appeared at the far entrance. He'd come back. He walked toward Durso with the specific, unhurried pace of a man managing something he needed to manage quickly without looking like he was managing anything. He put his hand on Durso's shoulder and steered him toward the corridor. Maya watched Durso's face as he was moved. She heard 2 words before the corridor swallowed them. Durso said, "They found it." And Holt said nothing, just kept moving. Maya set down the tray she was holding and told herself to breathe, and then went back to the serving line because she was still Maya Reed, kitchen contractor, and nothing had happened that Maya Reed would have understood. But she had 14 minutes, by her calculation, before something broke. And she didn't know in which direction it was going to break. The answer came at 0744. The base alarm, Dec. Not the fire alarm, the security alarm, the one with the specific tonal pattern that she'd been briefed on as part of her pre-insertion study of the facility, went active across the compound. 2 tones. Pause. 3 tones. Force protection level escalation. The dining facility didn't erupt. It organized, which was in some ways more alarming, the way soldiers with embedded training moved to pre-assigned positions without needing to be told, chairs pushing back, personnel streaming toward the exits with the compressed efficiency of people who had drilled this. Within 90 seconds, the room had gone from near full to empty, except for the kitchen staff, who had no assigned position and stood in the service area not knowing where to go. Delbert looked at Maya. "What do we do?" "Stay here," she said. "Don't go outside." How do you know it? I don't, she said. But until someone tells us otherwise, we stay put. She stayed at the kitchen threshold and watched the compound through the window above the dish sink. Personnel were moving toward the operations complex. The QRF trucks, she could hear them from here, were no longer idling. They were moving. She gave herself 30 seconds. Then she said to Delbert, I need to use the bathroom. He started to say something. She was already moving. The contractor housing block was 70 meters from the dining facility across an open service lane. During a force protection escalation, the service lanes were supposed to be clear of non-military personnel, which meant that crossing it was a risk. And Maya ran the risk in 3 seconds of decision-making and came down on the side of moving because standing still was no longer an option that served anything. She crossed the service lane at a pace that was just under a jog, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough to look like a person with a destination rather than a person fleeing. Nobody stopped her. She reached the housing block and got to her room and had the door closed behind her before she let herself move fast. And then she moved very fast. The panel came open. She had been doing this in her head for 6 hours, so her hands knew exactly where everything was and in what order. The hard case first. She laid it on the bed and opened it, and for the first time in 36 days she looked directly at what she'd been carrying beneath the floor of her assigned quarters at a forward operating base while spending her days carrying food trays and washing dishes. The platform was a Kessler 9 precision rifle, a configuration that didn't exist in any publicly available catalog, built to a specification that had been refined over several years of input from the 14 people who'd used it operationally. She'd been the 5th. The stock was adjustable carbon composite. The barrel assembly was suppressed and threaded for the specific ammunition she carried, subsonic match grade, hand-loaded to a tolerance that commercial manufacturers didn't bother with because the market for that level of precision was measured in single digits. She didn't assemble it yet, not in this room. She pulled the tactical kit from the rear of the panel, the plate carrier, stripped of all unit identification, rigged to her measurements and worn into the specific shape of her body over 3 years of use. The radio, encrypted, paired to a frequency that her handler monitored, the optics package. The range card she'd been building in her head for 5 weeks, every distance and elevation and wind variable of this compound, committed to the same memory she'd used to hold the security protocols and the personnel files and the 37 different details that had led her to this room at this moment. She was changed and rigged in 4 minutes, which was 40 seconds slower than her personal best and 30 seconds faster than she needed to be. She keyed the radio once, the single-click check-in that told her handler she was active and in position. The response came back in 4 seconds. 2 clicks. Confirmed. You're cleared. She picked up the rifle case and left the room. The eastern perimeter of Bravo Kestrel Forward Operating Base had a section of secondary fence line that ran behind the maintenance compound, accessible from the civilian contractor area through a service gate that was locked with a standard padlock. The lock was rated for deterrence, not resistance. She'd assessed it in week 2. It took her 11 seconds. Outside the secondary fence, the ground dropped away into a shallow drainage channel that ran parallel to the fence line for approximately 60 meters before opening into the flat scrub terrain beyond the base perimeter. The channel was dry this time of year and deep enough to move through at a crouch without being visible from the base wall. She went north along the channel for 40 meters, then stopped. The overwatch position she'd identified in week 3 was a section of elevated ground, not much, maybe 4 meters of relative height advantage, but in terrain this flat, 4 meters changed everything about what you could see and how far you could see it. A natural fold in the earth that had probably been formed by water drainage, now dry and covered in sparse vegetation and a scatter of flat rocks that were large enough to use as ground contact. She assembled the rifle in the channel before she climbed to the position, working by touch and feel the way she'd done it in darkness and in noise, and once in the back seat of a moving vehicle. The assembly took 90 seconds. She ran a chamber check, confirmed the suppressor torque, extended the bipod. Then she climbed to the position and looked at the base. Through the optic, at the magnification she dialed, the compound opened up in sections. The operations complex, the communications building, the primary vehicle staging area, the service lanes between buildings. The alarm was still running, She could see personnel at the edges of the buildings, the QRF trucks positioned near the main gate. She started a systematic scan, the operations complex first. Activity around the main entrance. 6, maybe 7 people. One of them in civilian clothes, which meant either a contractor or a visitor, and she paused on that figure for a moment before moving on. The communications building had 2 guards posted at the exterior that hadn't been there yesterday. The primary vehicle staging area was... She stopped the scan. Southwest corner of the vehicle staging area, Braddock. He was moving with purpose. Not the casual pace of a man going to a vehicle, but the compressed stride of someone on a specific timeline. He was carrying something in his left hand. A bag, civilian soft-sided, the kind that passed without comment in a dozen different environments. He reached a light tactical vehicle and put the bag in the rear seat. He got in. He did not appear to be going anywhere he had authorization to go, because nobody got in vehicles during a force protection escalation without a specific mission tasking, and if he had a specific mission tasking, he would not have been in the vehicle alone. She tracked right. The eastern side of the operations compound. Holt was there, near the external generator housing, and he was talking on a radio, not the standard base radio, which had a specific form factor she'd memorized. The device in his hand was smaller, civilian grade, the kind of encrypted commercial unit that you could buy in certain markets if you knew where to look. She ran the geometry of what she was seeing. Braddock at the vehicle. Holt on a non-base radio, presumably in contact with someone external. The alarm still running. QRF trucks at the gate. And Durso. She scanned back through the compound, methodically. Durso was not visible anywhere in the areas she could cover, which meant he was either inside a building or he was already moving. Her radio clicked twice. Her handler's signal. She clicked back once, still observing. The next 3 clicks were slower. She translated them automatically. Command element inbound, 7 minutes, 7 minutes. She exhaled and reset her position and went back to the scope and kept tracking. And the thing that had been in the small box for 5 weeks was gone now because she'd opened the box and let it out. And what replaced it was the thing that had no name. The specific quality of attention that arrived when everything external fell away. And there was only the scope and the distance and the variables and the decision tree that she was already working through. Braddock started the vehicle. She moved the scope to the gate. The gate guard was watching the internal compound, not the vehicle staging area. Braddock pulled out of the staging area and headed toward the secondary service exit. Not the main gate, the secondary, which was used for maintenance vehicles, and was monitored by a single camera and a single guard who was currently standing 20 meters from his post, looking toward the operations complex where the noise of the escalation was concentrated. She tracked the vehicle. She was doing math in her head. Distance, angle, the lag time between when she could radio an intercept request and when anyone could actually act on it. The 7 minutes until command inbound, the 90 seconds it would take Braddock to reach the secondary gate at the speed he was traveling. The math didn't work. She keyed the radio. Mobile element, southwest vehicle staging, secondary gate vector. She gave the vehicle description and plate number, which she'd memorized when she'd cataloged the motor pool in week 2. 1 occupant, non-authorized movement during force protection escalation. Intercept requested. The response was immediate. No available element at secondary gate. QRF committed at primary. She tracked the vehicle and ran the math again. Same answer. She switched frequencies, going to the base internal net, the channel she was not supposed to be on, using the equipment that Maya Reed, the kitchen contractor, was absolutely not supposed to have. She clicked the transmit button once and spoke in the flat, unhurried tone that communicated information rather than emotion. Security net, this is Sierra 7. Unauthorized vehicle movement, secondary gate. Imminent breach. Single occupant, likely armed. Request immediate halt order. Silence on the net for 3 full seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Who is this? Identify. Sierra 7. The vehicle needs to stop, now. Another pause, shorter. Then she heard the gate guard frequency crackle in the background of the net, and a different voice giving a halt order. She watched through the scope. The vehicle slowed, stopped. The gate guard was moving toward it. She exhaled and shifted the scope back to Holt. He'd heard something, maybe the radio traffic, maybe the change in the pattern of movement visible from his position. He was no longer talking on the civilian device. He was looking toward the secondary gate, and she could read his posture from 400 meters because she had been reading him for 5 weeks, and she knew what his stillness looked like, and this was not it. He made a decision. She saw it before he moved, the slight shift of weight, the thing that happened in a person's body in the fraction of a second before they committed to an action. Then he started walking, fast, toward the operations complex, and he was going somewhere specific, not retreating. She tracked him. He went to a side door of the operations complex and used a keycard to access it, and the door swallowed him, and she lost him. She stayed on the scope, scanning, running through what she knew. Braddock stopped at the secondary gate, Holt now inside the operations complex, Durso unaccounted for, command element 7 minutes out. And the thing she'd been missing the entire time, the piece of the picture she hadn't been able to confirm, suddenly became visible not through observation but through logic. She hadn't been looking at what they were building toward. She'd been looking at the components, the communications breach, the access to operational planning materials, Holt inside the operations complex during a force protection escalation, a civilian communication device on a separate encrypted channel. What was inside the operations complex during a force protection escalation? The entire command element, every senior officer and NCO on base, in a contained location during a security event that they were currently managing, which meant they were focused inward on the base rather than outward on a threat. The command element that was supposed to be the contained target had command inbound in 7 minutes, which meant the senior leadership that would normally be in that complex was currently in helicopters, not in the building. She ran it again. If someone had wanted to target the operations complex command center during a period when the senior leadership was in transit and the base was in a heightened but internally focused security posture, she was already moving. Down from the position, scope folded, moving at a run through the drainage channel because there was no longer any calculation to make about cover. She was going back in. She keyed the radio as she ran. Sierra 7 to command net. Potential threat element inside operations complex. Holt, Garrett, SEAL detachment, armed, likely. Interior approach required. She hit the fence line and went over it. 4 seconds, the rifle slung, and dropped into the service lane on the far side and was moving toward the operations complex before her feet were fully under her. 3 personnel saw her. None of them recognized who they were seeing. They saw a woman in full tactical kit with a precision rifle moving across the compound with the complete absence of hesitation. And for a full 2 seconds, none of them processed it as something that required a response, because everything about her movement communicated authority that their brains tried to assign to an expected category before they understood there was no expected category for what they were looking at. She reached the side door, the same one Holt had used, and stopped. She didn't have a key card. A second passed. The door opened from the inside. Finch was standing there. He looked at her, at the kit, the rifle, the expression on her face, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. And she watched him run through every interaction they'd had, the dish window morning, the hallway outside the housing block, watch yourself, and she saw the moment he arrived at the correct conclusion. He stepped back and held the door. He went left, Finch said. Server room. How far? 40 meters, 3rd door. She went through. The interior corridor was narrow and fluorescent lit, the kind of functional construction that existed solely to connect spaces rather than be a space itself. She moved fast, rifle at the low carry, and she counted doors. 3rd door on the left. She stopped outside it and ran a quick assessment of what she knew about the server room. She'd never been inside the operations complex, but the base layout had been in her pre-insertion brief, and the server room was centrally located, air-conditioned, access-controlled. It was also the location of the primary communications relay for the base's encrypted command net. If you wanted to interrupt a command element's ability to coordinate a response during a crisis, the server room was where you went. She tried the handle. Locked. From inside, she heard a sound. Something falling, something metallic, and then the specific sound of a person moving fast in a confined space. She had options. The explosive breach option required equipment she hadn't brought for a situation she hadn't anticipated being at this address in this way. The lock itself was a commercial access control card reader, which meant it had a bypass keypad underneath the panel cover. She pulled the panel. The bypass code was a 6-digit factory default that base facilities personnel frequently didn't change because base facilities personnel were busy people with many problems, and changing bypass codes on interior access control locks was not at the top of anyone's priority list. She tried the factory default. The light went green. She went in low. The server room was cold and loud with the white noise of cooling equipment, and it was not large, maybe 10 meters by 12. Racks of equipment along 3 walls, a work terminal in the center, harsh overhead fluorescent lighting. Holt was at the far rack, and he was not running an exfiltration. He was planting something. She saw it before he heard her. A device, palm-sized, already attached to the rack housing with what she recognized as a magnetic clamp. The design didn't matter. The function was legible in the shape and the placement. He heard her on the second step and turned. His face did the thing faces did when a situation resolved into something the person hadn't prepared for. She'd seen that expression many times. It was the expression of a man who had run a very complete plan and had not included this particular variable. "Don't," she said. He looked at her, at the rifle, at the kit, at her face, and she watched him run the same calculation she'd watched him run every time he'd assessed the room she was standing in, except this time the variable he was assessing was her. "Read," he said. "Step away from the rack." He didn't move immediately. His hands were at his sides, which was good, but his weight was wrong, shifted toward his right, which was not. "You're not," he started. "I know what I am," she said. "Step away from the rack. Hands visible. Do it right now." A beat. Long enough that she felt the decision tree compress down to its final branch. Then he moved away from the rack. His hands came up, not high, but visible, and he stepped toward the center of the room, and Maya moved to the rack and looked at the device without touching it and confirmed what she'd assessed from across the room. She keyed her radio without lowering the rifle. Sierra 7 to EOD. Server room, operations complex. Device located and isolated. 1 subject in custody. EOD priority. She looked at Holt. He was looking at her with an expression that had settled past the initial shock into something quieter and harder to read. Not defiance. Not quite. The specific expression of a man reassessing everything he'd believed about a situation and finding the new picture very different from the old one. "How long?" he said. She didn't answer. "The kitchen? The whole time." He looked at the floor briefly. "You're not a contractor." "No," she said. "I'm not." He didn't say anything else, neither did she. The cooling system hummed. Somewhere outside the building she could hear the helicopters. Not landing now, different approach, lower and closer, which meant the inbound command element was being redirected to a new landing zone, which meant someone at command level had received her radio traffic and acted on it. She kept the rifle on him. He kept his hands visible. The door opened behind her. 2 base security personnel, weapons up, filling the threshold. She identified herself without turning. "Sierra 7. Subject is Holt Garrett, SEAL Detachment. Treat as hostile. EOD device on the rack. Do not approach until clearance." One of them moved past her to cover Holt. She lowered the rifle and looked at the device on the rack and felt the adrenaline drain through her system in the specific way it always did. Not like it was leaving, but like it was moving somewhere else, settling into a different part of her body where it would live for the next several hours as a kind of vibration she'd learned to work around. Her hands were shaking slightly. They always did after. Nobody who'd ever seen her work believed that, but it was true. The shaking came from the release, not the action. During the action, she was the steadiest she ever was. It was the afterward that cost her. She made a fist until it stopped. Then she looked at the security team. "Braddock is at the secondary gate. Durso is unaccounted for inside the base. You need both of them before anything else." One of them got on his radio. She stood in the cold server room with the hum of the equipment around her and the device on the rack, and the man she'd been watching for 5 weeks now in flex cuffs being walked toward the door, and she thought about the 31 days she'd spent invisible, and the tray that had been knocked over, and the hallway with Braddock, and the dish window, and the cold floor of her room. And the thing that had been in the box was gone. And there was nothing dramatic about that. It was just done. EOD arrived 7 minutes later. Two of them, in full kit, moving through the server room door with the specific economy of people who had been trained to slow down when everything else was speeding up. Maya stepped back and let them work, and stood against the far wall with the rifle at her side and watched them assess the device with the detached focus of professionals who had seen worse. The lead technician, a staff sergeant with a steady hands quality that Maya recognized from a particular kind of experience, looked at the device for 40 seconds without touching it, then looked back at her. "It's a disruptor," he said. "Not explosive. Designed to fry the relay architecture. Whole command net goes down, you can't coordinate a response to anything for 4 to 6 hours, minimum. Timed? Remote trigger. Somebody outside needed to hit a switch." He looked at the device again. "Good thing nobody hit the switch." Braddock had been in the vehicle. She thought about the bag in the back seat, the civilian device. "The man at the secondary gate," she said. "Search his vehicle. Soft-sided bag. Rear seat. That's your remote." The technician looked at the security personnel, and one of them got back on the radio. Maya walked out of the server room. The hallway outside was more crowded than it had Bapu 4 minutes ago. Base security, 2 of the operations compound's permanent duty officers, and at the far end coming through the main entrance with the particular forward momentum of someone who had just arrived and immediately needed to be everywhere, a man she didn't know. Tall, late 50s, 2 stars on his collar. He stopped when he saw her. She didn't stop. They met in the middle of the corridor, and she read him the way she'd been reading everyone for 5 weeks. The set of his shoulders, the quality of his attention, the fact that he'd clocked her kit and her rifle before he'd clocked her face, which told her his threat assessment was running even in environments where he was nominally in control. "You're Reed," he said. "Yes, sir." "I'm Calloway." He didn't offer a handshake. Neither did she. "Walk with me." They went to a room off the main corridor, a small conference space, 4 chairs, a table, a whiteboard with nothing on it. Calloway closed the door and didn't sit. Neither did she. "Sit rep," he said. She gave it to him the way she'd been trained to give sit reps. Chronological, factual, no editorializing, the kind of delivery that gave a commander the information he needed without the color that obscured it. Holt, Durso, Braddock, the clandestine meeting on day 3, the exchange in the dining facility on day 35, the tattoo, the package in Durso's workspace, the disruptor device, the timing relative to the command element's transit. Calloway listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The device was meant to black out the command net while the helicopters were inbound," he said. "That's my assessment. But with the QRF committed at the primary gate and the senior staff in transit, they'd have had a window. Approximately 20 minutes, enough to compromise the landing zone coordination and redirect the inbound command element into a position where," she paused, "where something could have been waiting for them." He looked at her steadily. "You're saying they were going to kill us." "I'm saying the architecture of it points that direction. The specific end state would need to come from the interrogation." He nodded once, then, "Durso. Still unaccounted for when I entered the building. Your security teams have a location?" "They found him in the communications building 20 minutes ago. He was trying to access a terminal and couldn't. The lockdown had pulled his credentials." He crossed his arms. "He's in custody." 3 subjects, 3 in custody. She ran through the checklist and found nothing missing, which was the best outcome available for a mission that had gone significantly sideways from the parameters it started with. "You went outside the wire," Calloway said. "Yes, sir." "During a force protection escalation?" "Yes, sir." "Without authorization from this command?" She looked at him. "My authorization came from above this command." He held her gaze. She didn't look away because this was the part of missions that people who hadn't run them didn't fully understand. That the debrief sometimes required a different kind of steadiness than the operation itself, and that the people in the rooms after were not always easier to navigate than the people in the field during. "You're going to tell me," he said, "that if you'd waited for a proper authorization chain, the disruptor would have gone active, the net would have been down, and my command element would have been walking into something." "I'm going to let you draw your own conclusions, sir." A beat of silence. "Sit down, Reed." She sat. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat as well, and the formality of the exchange shifted by about 15 degrees, which was not the same as becoming informal. "Your handler briefed me 30 minutes ago," he said. "You are further forward than your mission scope anticipated. The situation moved faster than the scope anticipated. That happens." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "What I need to understand, from you, directly, is whether there are additional subjects. Anyone you observed that didn't make your primary report." She thought about Finch. The way he'd said, "Watch yourself," in the path outside the housing block. The way he'd held the door in the operations complex corridor and said he went left, server room, without being asked. She thought about that for a full 3 seconds. "One individual," she said. "I don't have a confirmed read on his involvement or lack of it. He may have been aware of the operation without being part of it. He may have been entirely clear. I don't have enough to give you a clean assessment either direction. Name: Finch, SEAL Detachment." Calloway wrote it down. "What's your instinct?" "He held a door for me and told me where Holt had gone." She paused. "My instinct is that he's not part of it. But instinct isn't evidence, and I've been wrong before." "Good answer." He stood. "You'll be in formal debrief in 40 minutes. Everything you just told me, plus everything you didn't, on the record. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." He moved to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth, Reed, the work you did here, the 5 weeks, the approach, the server room." He paused. "The scope of what you prevented is going to take a few days to fully map, but I understand enough of it right now to know it was significant." She nodded. "That's not the debrief compliment," he said. "That's just the truth." He left. She sat in the empty room for a moment, and her hands were steady now, and the vibration from earlier had settled into the background where it lived. Then she got up and went to find water, because she'd been running on 3 hours of sleep and institutional coffee and adrenaline for the better part of a day, and her body was presenting a clear accounting of that fact. The formal debrief took 2 hours and 40 minutes. There were 4 people in the room. Calloway, a woman from the same command-level office as Maya's handler who introduced herself only by her first initial and her role, a base legal officer who was there to ensure the procedural record was clean, and a man from the NCIS field office who had apparently been airborne toward Bravo Kestrel before Maya had even transmitted her first emergency burst, which told her the investigation had been running at a level she hadn't been fully read into. She told them everything. The meeting by the motor pool on day 3, the dining facility exchange, the tattoo, the specific symbology in its source document, the security office interview where she'd withheld, the communications equipment, the burst transmissions, the handler responses, the fence line, the drainage channel, the overwatch position and what she'd observed from it, Braddock at the vehicle, Holt on the civilian device, the bypass code on the server room door. The NCIS man stopped her there. "The bypass code," he said. "You tried the factory default." "Yes." "And it worked." "Yes." He made a note. "That's going to be a separate remediation action item." "I figured." The legal officer, who had been largely silent, leaned forward. "Ms. Reed, Captain Reed, when you transmitted on the base internal security net, you used a call sign, Sierra 7. That's not in your mission documentation. It's a standing designation from a previous deployment. It's not on any document in your file that this office has." She looked at him. "Then there are documents in my file that your office doesn't have." He wrote something down without responding to that, which was the correct response. The debrief moved through the server room encounter and into the custody of the 3 subjects. Holt had been processed and separated from base population. Durso was in a designated holding facility pending formal charges. Braddock had been found with the remote trigger device in the bag, as she'd assessed, and had been moved immediately out of the base's custody chain and into a federal transport, which told her that the network connection, the regional organization whose symbol she'd identified on his wrist, had activated a specific response protocol that went above the military justice system. She answered every question they asked and volunteered 3 things they hadn't asked but needed to know. When it was over, Calloway walked her out. The base had normalized in the way that bases normalized after significant events. Not calm exactly, but organized. The machinery of institutional response running the way it was designed to run. Personnel at their posts, vehicles properly staged, the alarm system back to baseline. The server room team had removed the disruptor device for full analysis. The fence gate she'd gone through was already tagged for a security review. The remediation on the gate is going to reference an unspecified breach, Calloway said as they walked. Your name won't be in that report. I appreciate that. Don't. He glanced at her. It's not a favor. It's procedural. Your presence here is classified at a level that doesn't belong in a maintenance report. They walked past the dining facility. Through the window she could see the interior. Empty tables, chairs still pushed back from the rushed evacuation, a tray sitting where someone had set it down on the serving counter and never come back for it. She looked at it as she walked past and felt something that wasn't quite anything she had a good word for. Not nostalgia. More like the specific strange quality of looking at a version of the world that had been real very recently and wasn't real anymore. The kitchen staff, she said. Delbert. He's been here 3 years. He's not involved in any of this. I know. He's going to have questions about where I went this morning. He'll be told that you were part of a security response team and your cover assignment has concluded, nothing more. He paused. Is there a concern there? She thought about Delbert drying the already dry dish, the way he'd said long day for everyone. No, she said. He's a decent man who runs a clean kitchen. Just make sure someone tells him something that makes sense. Calloway nodded. They stopped outside the operations complex entrance. Around them, the base moved at its altered rhythm. Still elevated, but functional. The specific organized recovery mode that followed a crisis when the crisis had been contained rather than realized. Finch, Calloway said. We spoke to him. She waited. His account is consistent with yours. He says he became aware approximately 2 weeks ago that something was wrong with Holt's behavior. He didn't report it through channels because, he paused, choosing the word carefully, because the channels in question ran through the same element that Holt was senior to, and he wasn't confident in the integrity of the reporting structure. He tried to tell me in the only way he could without knowing who I was, she said. That's his account. What happens to him? Nothing negative. He's going to be interviewed in depth for the next several days. If his account holds, and I believe it will, he goes back to his unit. Calloway looked at her. He did ask about you after we spoke to him. What did he ask? He asked if you were okay. She didn't say anything for a moment. Tell him yes, she said. They gave her a room in the command complex for the night, not the contractor housing block, which was being processed as part of the investigation documentation, but a proper room with a door that locked from the inside and a bed that was narrower but better than the one she'd been sleeping on for 5 weeks. She sat on the edge of it and looked at her hands. The rifle was in the armory now. They'd logged it, tagged it, assigned it a document number. It would be transported back through the appropriate channels. She'd sign for it again at her home unit, which felt very far away and very close at the same time. Someone knocked. Come in. The door opened and a young specialist she didn't recognize came in carrying a tray. Actual food, not the steam table variety she'd been eating for 5 weeks. Something that had been cooked with some deliberate attention. A bottle of water. The specialist set the tray down on the small desk and looked at her with the particular expression of junior personnel who had been briefed that someone important was in this room and weren't quite sure how to calibrate. Sergeant Major Villanueva sent this, the specialist said. Tell him thank you. Yes, ma'am. The specialist left. She ate. The food was not remarkable, but it was warm and real, and she was hungrier than she'd allowed herself to notice during the hours of operational activity, and she finished most of it before she set it aside. Then she lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, which was a different ceiling than the one she'd been staring at for 5 weeks, and thought about the tray on the serving counter in the empty dining facility, and about what Finch had asked, and about the 31 days of carrying food and washing dishes and being invisible, and about how none of that had actually been invisible, because the whole point of it was to see without being seen, to know without being known. And she had done that. She had done that, and 3 men were in custody, and the command element had landed safely, and the server room relay was intact, and the base net was running, and the specific shape of catastrophe that had been building on a timeline she'd only partially understood was no longer building. That was the job. She'd done it imperfectly, sloppily, outside her parameters, with a bypass code that worked because somebody hadn't updated a factory default, and with an assist from a man who'd said, "Watch yourself in a service path," because he couldn't say anything else. That was how it usually went. The clean version existed in after-action reports. The real version was what she was lying on a narrow bed thinking about, with slightly shaking hands in someone else's borrowed room at a base where everyone was going to look at her differently tomorrow. She would deal with tomorrow. She closed her eyes. In the morning, they came to her. Not all at once. That wasn't how it happened. It started with Villanueva, who knocked at 0700 and stood in the doorway with the clipboard he seemed to carry as a permanent extension of his left arm, and looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing a prior assessment. "Contractor verification records are going to need an amendment," he said. "I imagine so. My interview with you yesterday." He tapped the clipboard. "There's a note in here where I wrote unproblematic. That seems accurate." He looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm going to change it to significantly understated." She let herself have a small one in return. "That's probably more accurate." He left. At 0730, two of the operations compound duty officers came to ask procedural questions about the server room bypass. Not accusatory, genuinely trying to understand what had happened for their own security review. She answered them factually and without apology, and when one of them said almost involuntarily, "You knew the factory default code," she said, "Yes," without elaborating, and neither of them pushed it. At 0900, Calloway came back with a man she'd seen in the initial arrival group, younger than Calloway, the particular pressed quality of someone from an oversight function rather than a field function. He introduced himself as being from the Inspector General's office. She sat through his questions with the patience she'd applied to 5 weeks of kitchen work, which was considerable. He was thorough. She respected thorough. He went through every decision she'd made that deviated from her original mission parameters. The upgrade in her active posture following the handler response, the fence breach, the server room bypass, the transmission on the base internal net, and she explained each one with the specific clarity that came from having made each decision for a reason she could articulate. "The transmission on the security net," he said. "You identified yourself as Sierra 7. Personnel responded to that call sign." "Yes." "They didn't know who Sierra 7 was." "No." "But they acted on the transmission." "A vehicle was about to breach the secondary gate during a force protection escalation. The content of the transmission was actionable regardless of the source." He wrote something down. "You're aware that transmitting on a restricted frequency without authorization is—" "Yes," she said. "I'm aware." He looked at her. "Is there anything you would have done differently?" She thought about it genuinely, because the question deserved a genuine answer. "I would have moved to the Overwatch position 48 hours earlier," she said. "I had enough of the picture by day 33. I was waiting for confirmation I already had." He made another note. "That's an interesting answer." "It's an honest one." He closed his folder. The IG review took 2 more days to complete. She was on base for all of it, in the command complex room, available when they needed her, and otherwise doing nothing in particular, which was its own kind of strange after 5 weeks of constant performance. She walked the base in the mornings without a kitchen uniform and without a clipboard and without any particular cover, just a woman in a base-issue gray shirt and her own pants, and people looked at her in the way people looked at someone they didn't have a category for. She ate in the dining facility. Delbert saw her on the second morning. He was behind the line, the same position she'd worked, and he looked at her and processed what he was seeing. The lack of kitchen uniform, the way she was moving through the space differently than she'd moved through it for 5 weeks. And she watched him arrive at the conclusion that he'd been told to arrive at. He didn't say anything. He put eggs on her tray. She said, "They're better than usual." He looked at her for a moment. "Been saying that for 3 years." Then he moved to the next person. She carried her tray to a table and sat and ate, and the dining facility did its morning thing around her, and she was both in it and completely removed from it, which was the only way she'd ever known how to exist in a space like this. On the third day, Calloway called her in. The formal documentation was complete. The three subjects were in the appropriate custody frameworks: Holt and Durso in military detention pending courts-martial proceedings. Braddock transferred to federal jurisdiction given the confirmed network affiliation. The network connection was being pursued at a level above this base and above Calloway's command, which was as much as he told her about that. "The IG review is closed," he said. "No adverse findings against your conduct." "I know." He looked at her. "You knew before I told you." The IG officer's questions changed on day 2. When someone stops asking about a specific decision, it usually means they've resolved it. Calloway shook his head slightly. "Your orders back to your home unit are cut for tomorrow morning. Transport at 0600. "Understood." "You'll get a full mission debrief at command level when you're back, beyond what we've covered here." He paused. The device, the network connection, the scope of what they were building toward, it's larger than what happened at this base. Your documentation of the relationship between Holt and Durso over the past 5 weeks is going to be significant for the broader investigation. She thought about 31 days of carrying that documentation in her head. No notes, no recordings, just memory and attention. "I hope it's useful," she said. He walked her to the door. Outside the operations complex, the base was running on its regular tempo. Morning activities, vehicles moving on scheduled routes, the distant clatter of the maintenance crews. The dining facility had its first smoke curling from the ventilation stack, which meant Delbert was already in the kitchen. "One more thing," Calloway said. She looked at him. "Braddock." In the formal processing, when his full background came out, he paused. He'd been in that network for 11 years. Before the teams, during, after. Everything in his service record that looked clean was constructed. Every evaluation, every commendation. He looked at the compound. 11 years. She thought about the flat smile in the hallway, the intelligence collection at the dish window, the quality of his attention in the moment he'd noticed something real about the way she stood. He had good instincts, she said, about people. He did, Calloway said, just not good enough. She stood outside the operations complex for a moment after Calloway went back inside and looked at the compound. The morning was doing its ordinary thing, light coming in flat from the east, the smell of dust and exhaust that she'd stopped noticing in week 2 and was now noticing again the way you notice things when you knew you were about to leave them. Personnel crossing the open ground between buildings. A vehicle pulling out of the motor pool on a scheduled route. The dining facility smoke still rising. 38 days. She'd arrived with a fake identity and a kitchen apron and a rifle under the floor, and she was leaving with all 3 still intact, which was not the worst accounting she'd ever made of a deployment. She went back to the command complex room and packed what little there was to pack. The transport wasn't until 0600 the next morning, which gave her an afternoon and an evening with nothing operationally required of her for the first time in 5 weeks, and she didn't entirely know what to do with that. She walked. Not a perimeter check, not a patrol pattern, not the measured movement of a person managing their visibility. Just walking. She went through the parts of the base she'd studied from the outside and the parts she'd worked in and the parts she'd only seen in the layout document from her pre-insertion brief, and she let her body move at whatever pace it wanted, which turned out to be slower than she expected. She ended up at the eastern fence line. Not the section she'd breached. That was to the north, behind the maintenance compound. This was the regular perimeter, chain link with standard concertina, a guard tower at the near corner that was staffed with the rotation she'd memorized in week 1. The terrain beyond the wire was flat and dry, the same scrub and dust that framed every base she'd ever been assigned to, slightly different in the specific texture of its emptiness. She stood at the fence and looked out at it. The overwatch position was visible from here. The fold in the ground, 4 meters of elevation that had been enough. It looked small from this angle. Most things did, afterward. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn. She'd heard them coming from 20 meters out. "Reed." Finch stopped beside her. He was in his working uniform, no kit, hands in the pockets of his trousers in a way that communicated off-duty without making a performance of it. They stood at the fence together for a moment without speaking. "Calloway told you they cleared me," he said. "He told me. I want to explain." "You don't have to." "I want to." He took his hands out of his pockets and crossed his arms, looking at the terrain beyond the wire. "When I started to see it, Holt's behavior, the patterns, I ran through every way I could report it, and every channel ran through him, or through people who trusted him. 8 years in the teams, his reputation." He shook his head. "Nobody was going to hear me." "So you told the kitchen contractor to watch herself." He looked at her. "I didn't know who you were." "I know. I just knew you weren't what you said you were. The first week." He paused. "The way you moved, the way you watched things. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't nothing." She thought about Braddock saying the same thing in the hallway, from the opposite direction. The way she walked. It was always the walk that people picked up on first when they were paying attention. She'd never entirely solved that problem and probably never would. "You held a door," she said. "You were running. I figured you knew something I didn't." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "How many of them were there, total?" 3 primary. The network they were connected to is a larger investigation." "Holt." He said the name flatly, the way people said names when they were still processing what those names had turned out to mean. 8 years, deployments together. I trained with him." He looked at the fence. "I thought I knew him." "Most people don't know the people they think they know," she said. "That's not a failure, it's just the way it works." "Feels like a failure." "I know." She meant it, and he seemed to understand that she did, because he didn't argue with it or try to push past it. He just stood there with it, which was the right thing to do. After a minute, he said, "Where do you go from here? Home unit? Debrief? Then wherever the next thing is." "There's always a next thing." "Yes," she said. "There usually is." He unfolded his arms and looked at her with an expression that was harder to categorize than most. Not quite respect, not quite the residual discomfort of a man who'd been operating near someone he'd fundamentally misread, something more mixed than either of those. "For what it's worth," he said, "I never thought you were invisible. I just didn't know what I was seeing." She looked at him. "That's worth something." He nodded once, then he walked back toward the operations compound. She turned back to the fence and the flat terrain and the fold in the ground that had been enough. And she stood there for another few minutes until the light changed and the early evening started to come in from the east. And then she went to find dinner. She ate in the dining facility for the last time. Delbert was still behind the line. He was going to be behind the line for the next 30 years, she suspected, because some people found their correct position in the world and stayed in it, and there was nothing wrong with that. He put food on her tray without being asked. She said, "I'm leaving tomorrow morning." "I heard." He adjusted something on the steam table that didn't need adjusting. "The thing that happened, the security situation." "Yes, you were part of that." It wasn't entirely a question. She answered it as if it were. "Yes." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man integrating a piece of information that changed the shape of a picture he'd been looking at for 5 weeks. "I told the general you were reliable," he said, "in the verification interview." "I know, thank you for that." "I meant it when I said it." He looked at her for a moment. "I still mean it, just for different reasons now." She picked up her tray. "You run a good kitchen, Delbert." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I run a fine kitchen. The eggs are still terrible." She carried her tray to a table and sat and ate, and the dining facility was quieter than its normal evening rhythm. Still some residual elevated alert quality in the way people moved and talked. The specific texture of a space that had been through something and was still in the early phase of returning to itself. She sat with it. In the morning, she would be on a transport, and this base and these people and this particular version of herself would begin the process of becoming a past thing, one more completed deployment filed in the part of her that kept such records. That was fine. That was how it worked. You did the thing, and you left it, and you went to the next thing. She finished her food and took the tray to the return window. At 04:45 the next morning, she was up and dressed and sitting in the command complex room with her bag packed in 45 minutes before transport. At 05:12, Calloway knocked. She opened the door. He was in full uniform, which meant he'd been up for a while or hadn't gone to sleep, and he was carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, which told her the knock wasn't official business. He held one out. She took it. They stood in the doorway because the room was small and the hallway was empty at this hour, and neither of them needed to be formal about a cup of coffee. Full command level debrief is scheduled for 10 days from now, he said. Your handler will provide the location. Understood. The investigation that's running from the network connection, the one above our level. He looked at the coffee cup. They're going to want you read into it, possibly in a more active capacity. She thought about that, what it meant, what it would look like. Is that a question? She said. It's a heads up. He looked at her. You don't have to decide anything right now. I know. She drank the coffee. It was better than the dayroom machine, but not by much, which meant it had come from the same general source and someone had just made it more recently. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The timing of the inbound command element. You knew, before I made contact, before the burst transmission, you knew the timeline was elevated. He was quiet for a moment. We had indicators, nothing with the specificity you were building from the inside. If you'd been read into my mission from the start, we would have moved too early and with too much, he said, and Holt's network connection would have gone to ground before we had anything documented. He looked at her. I know what you're asking. The answer is no. You weren't held back deliberately to take on more risk. The separation was procedural, but you're right that it created a gap. The gap almost didn't work out. Almost, he said. Almost is the whole job. She drank the rest of the coffee and handed him back the empty cup. I'm going to make a procedural change, he said, for future embedded operations at installations under my command. The mission scope authorization timeline is getting compressed, 48 hours max for handler response, not the standing window. She thought about the 24-hour window, the 5 hours she'd waited after the burst transmission, what those hours had contained. That's a good change, she said. It's your change, he said. I'm just implementing it. He left. She picked up her bag and sat back down and waited for 0600. The transport was a military logistics aircraft, 12 personnel and a load of equipment bound for a transit hub 3 hours out. She sat in the webbing along the interior wall and put her head back against the fuselage and let the engine noise fill in the space where thought would otherwise be. She slept for most of it. Not the managed 90-minute blocks of deployment sleep, but the real kind. Deep, unstructured, the sleep of a body that had been told it was finally allowed. She woke up with 20 minutes left in the flight and a crick in her neck from the angle of the webbing and the specific groggy quality that came from sleeping hard in a moving vehicle. And she sat with it and looked at the other personnel and felt, for the first time in 38 days, completely ordinary. That was its own kind of relief. At the transit hub, she had a 4-hour layover before the connecting flight to her home unit's post. She found a corner of the terminal that was away from the main foot traffic and called a number from memory. It rang 3 times. You're out, said the voice on the other end. I'm out, she said. How bad was it? She thought about the server room, the bypass code, Finch holding the door, the shaking hands after. Medium, she said. Could have been worse. It's always medium when it could have been worse. Yeah. She leaned her head back against the wall. I'm going to need a few days when I get back. You've got them. Debrief isn't for 10 days. I know, Calloway's office confirmed. A pause on the line. The scope of it is still coming in. The network connection, the documentation from the 5 weeks. It's moving things at a level above what I can read you into from here. Calloway mentioned they may want me on the larger investigation. They will. The question is capacity and timing. Another pause. But that's 10 days from now. For right now, you get a few days in a real bed and food that someone cooked on purpose. She closed her eyes briefly. That sounds correct. Read. The voice changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but different. The shift that happened in a person when they set down the professional register and picked up something more direct. You did good work. I did adequate work with a lot of gaps in it. That's all any of us do. She said goodbye and ended the call and sat for a moment in the corner of the transit terminal with the noise of the facility moving around her. Announcements, footsteps, the distant clatter of equipment being moved, and felt the distance between who she'd been 48 hours ago, standing in a server room with a rifle on a man she'd been watching for 5 weeks, and who she was right now, which was a tired person in a transit terminal waiting for a flight. Both of those things were true at the same time. That was the job. She was home, or the closest thing she had to it, the post-housing unit that she'd been assigned for the past 2 years, 4 rooms and a narrow kitchen, and a view of the motor pool that she'd never bothered to do anything about. By 1900 that evening. She dropped her bag inside the door. She showered for a long time. She found food in the freezer that was old enough to be borderline, heated it anyway, ate it standing over the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like too much commitment to stillness. Then she washed the single pan she'd used and set it on the drying rack and stood in her own kitchen in the quiet. No engines, no alarm systems, no elevated patrol patterns, no dining facility sounds filtering through institutional walls. Just quiet. It had a specific quality, her own quiet. She'd forgotten that. The way a familiar silence felt different from an unfamiliar one, even when the sound level was the same. She went to the small desk in the second room, the one she'd always used for mission prep, cluttered with nothing because she'd been gone for over a month and nothing had accumulated, and sat down. There was a handwritten note on the desk. She hadn't left a note on the desk. She read it. Your mail is with Sergeant Okafor, Unit B. Didn't want it sitting outside. Oh. She looked at the note for a moment, at the handwriting, at the fact that someone had come by and thought about her mail sitting in the hall and done something about it. She set the note down carefully. Then she did something she hadn't done in 38 days. She didn't check the door. She didn't run a perimeter review. She didn't listen to the sounds outside and categorize them. She turned off the light in the second room and went to the bedroom and pulled back the covers on her own bed, which was familiar in the exact specific way that only your own bed was, and she lay down. She looked at the ceiling. The shaking in her hands had been gone since the first morning at the command complex. That was faster than usual. She noted that, filed it somewhere. She thought about the tray on the serving counter in the empty dining facility. She thought about Delbert saying for different reasons now. She thought about Finch at the fence line, arms crossed, looking at terrain that didn't owe anyone an explanation. She thought about 38 days of being invisible and what visible felt like now. Not triumphant, not clean, just the ordinary weight of a person who had done something hard and was on the other side of it. And the other side looked like a room in post-housing with a view of the motor pool and a note on the desk from someone who'd thought about her mail. She thought about the larger investigation, what it would require, what she'd say yes to, and what she wouldn't, and how that decision would get made. She thought she'd probably say yes. That was a problem for 10 days from now. She closed her eyes. 10 days later, she walked into a conference room at a location she hadn't been to before, a building attached to a command element whose full designation she wasn't going to think about in any context where it might matter, and took the seat she was directed to and looked at the 7 people across the table from her. Calloway was one of them. He gave her a nod. The others she cataloged in the first 30 seconds. 2 she recognized from their files, 3 she'd never seen documentation on, 1 who had the specific non-posture of someone very senior who had learned to look like they weren't. The person at the head of the table introduced herself briefly and got directly to it. What we're looking at, she said, is a network that's been running penetration operations against U.S. military forward elements for an estimated 7 years. What you documented at Bravo Kestrel is the clearest picture we've had of their method from the inside. Maya looked at the files that had been placed in front of her, photographs, organizational charts, locations. We want you on the investigation team, the woman said. Not in a kitchen this time, formally read in, active analytical and operational role. Maya looked at the files. She thought about Braddock. 11 years, every commendation constructed, everything that looked clean built to look that way. She thought about what 7 years of network penetration at that level meant in terms of what had been compromised and what was still being compromised right now. In other bases, in other positions, in other places where someone was watching people eat and being dismissed and carrying a different kind of weight under the floor. She looked up. What's the timeline, she said. Immediate. I was told I had 10 days. You had 9, said the woman. We started yesterday. Calloway made a sound that might have been a suppressed exhale. Maya looked at the files again. The photographs. The 7-year trail of it, the scope of it, the fact that what had happened at Bravo Kestrel was a single thread of something much larger that was still running. She thought about what Calloway had said in the hallway outside the operations complex. Almost is the whole job. She closed the top file and set her hands flat on the table. Then bring me up to speed, she said. Nobody in that room knew everything about her. That was fine. She didn't need them to. What she needed was the picture, the full scope of it, every thread and connection and name and location, and the space to do what she'd been doing for 12 years, which was watch until she understood something, and then act before anyone knew she was there. The woman at the head of the table started talking. Maya listened. The room was quiet and the files were in front of her. And outside the building, the world was doing its ordinary, complicated, dangerous thing. And somewhere in it, there were people who had built 11-year lives inside institutions they were working to destroy, and they had never yet accounted for what happened when the person they dismissed was the one person they couldn't afford to miss. She picked up a pen. She started making notes. The most dangerous thing you can do is decide someone isn't worth your attention. The person you overlook is the only one who gets to choose what they do with your blindness.